when I'm mixing, I tend to bypass or get rid of everything underneath like 12 cycles. Probably the biggest rule is that the more you put in your mix, the smaller things are going to have to be to fit. Dynamics are a very important part for me of delivering an emotion. I know how hot my mixes are. I don't print hot. I like mastering engineers. They have a value to me. I don't master my own mixes. For me, that tends to be the most common mistake these days, is people having actually.
This episode is brought to you by Baby Audio. Today on the podcast, we have Ross Hogarth. He's worked with Van Halen, Roger Waters, Def Leppard, R.E.M, and much more. We talk about how to make your mixes sound good everywhere, the best way to glue a mix, how to record guitars, and much more. Hey Ross, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So who inspired you early on? Was there an engineer, producer, or even a specific record that made you say, like, yeah, that's what I want to do?
That's such a deep question. I grew up in New York City, so I was influenced by the city. And New York has always been multicultural, musically diverse. My parents had incredibly diverse tastes. My mother's best friend was a folk singer named Pete Seeger. He was a very close family friend from the beginning to the end. And his music, folk music from around the world, also, is known as sort of the with him and Woody Guthrie, the kind of the fathers of folk music. So I grew up around banjos and fiddles and mandolins and acoustic instruments. But then, my father loved jazz and my mom sang, in church. And so it was, classical music and jazz. And then obviously as a kid, with older brothers, there's rock and roll, So I was incredibly influenced by the blues and classic rock. And I started as a drummer and then took my father's mandolin that didn't have all the strings and would play along to the radio. Needed melody. Took my brother's guitar. He wasn't going to become a guitar player. So, so I was influenced by everything. And so for me, that has influenced my career because it's all music. If you look at my discography, it looks kind of schizophrenic. It's all over the place. In one period of time, you'll see me producing like dark heavy metal, like Cold Chamber, literally right after that producing Ziggy Marley, and then, producing Devil Driver, but then Melissa Etheridge and, working with Kev Moe or Celine Dion or Motley Crue or Van Halen, it's all over the place. So for me, it's the influences, but I was always a kid that looked at every album cover. Like I would just scrutinize every album cover and read every credit can be influenced by, oh, this record sounds really good. Who made this record? Or these guitars are amazing. Or, check out John Bonham or The Who. Or so for me, I'm, kind of influenced by so many influences that we could spend the whole podcast talking about. But I do have some Desert Island, and most of my Desert Island records are 60s, 70s, maybe some early 80s and a mixture of decades. But, for me, it's, Stevie Wonder or Donny Hathaway or Miles Davis and John Coltrane or Mozart horn concertos or Joni Mitchell and then, Big Bill Broonzy or Freddie King. Or, So I'm just going through all these different genres, but these are the artists, Johnny Winter and Edgar Winter, who I have had the fortune of making records with Edgar and, winning the last Grammy with him. So for me, it's very diverse. I'd be bored if I only worked in one style of music, and I'd be bored if I only listened to one style of music. So I kind of try to keep my mind open. One morning I might be listening to Anderson .Paak or some cool hip hop, and another morning I might be listening to Mozart.
Cool. One of the most common questions get on this podcast is how do you make your mix sound great everywhere? So how do you approach that?
They don't want to go for the lower common denominator. So for me, like the last thing I'm going to be listening to are like earbuds or, um, some kind of iPhone.
Mhm.
I know my speakers in my studio. I know these other little speakers I have. IK makes some really great mod like speakers that can like Bluetooth. So for me, it's ultimately um, I'm not mixing to the earbud. I
Mhm.
just can't. I want my records to sound good in places that sound good. And then there's like some things would just always kind of sound, and pardon me if I swear, but sound shitty. Like to me, all these different earbuds, they all kind of have different frequency responses. So am I going to mix to some moving target, or am I going to mix to what I know it delivers a consistent, so you have to know your speakers.
Mhm. What speakers are you using right now?
I've been using the Key 3 speakers for many years. And I've been using Hot House that are small passive speakers that I have way overpowered Class D amplifiers on them, and there's a ton of headroom. And my room, as much as it's in my what was a 3-car garage, this
Mhm.
studio translates. I know my room. I've been mixing here for a few decades now, so um, you just have to understand and know that you're going to translate. I actually like mixing here better than anywhere else because I don't have to go to other studios and understand those rooms. I've
Mhm.
been here for so long. So I think it's really comes down to your knowing what you're getting. Um,
Mhm.
so that that's the answer to that question. I think some people are mixing to like a lower common denominator, which to me are like earbuds or the computer speaker or and for me, if my mixes sound good, they tend to sound good everywhere.
And how much of sounding good everywhere comes down to arrangement and production choices before the mix even starts?
Well, I mean, if I'm producing the record, I'm very aware of the. To me, a lot of things relate to, and not even if I'm producing. I mean, in general, mixing is for me. Uh, I come at it more from the balance engineer mentality,
Mhm.
where I'll sit with the the instruments and try to figure out the panning scheme, how they all integrate with each other. And I mean, probably the biggest rule is that the more you put in your mix, the smaller things are going to have to be to fit. So people that want really big drums but have like tons of guitars and tons of overdubs and keyboards and all these background vocals and everything, and then they want their drums to be huge. It's kind of hard because you have so much other sound that everything has to fight. Um, and so people tend to listen to things they like, and then they don't sort of follow the rules of the way that was produced. For example, like Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page didn't record with big, amps and tons of distortion. So the drums could sound big, but they're not really as big as people think they are. They just sound big because there's less stuff around them to make them small. It's like
Mhm.
if you listen to like a recording of a folk singer like from the '60s named Nick Drake. You know, um, like that's a vocal, acoustic guitar, and probably a cello and maybe a piano or something.
Mhm.
Or Elliott Smith or any Leonard Cohen. The vocal can sound big as a house because there's nothing in the way of it. The acoustic can sound huge. The minute you pound yourself with tons of other overdubs, things get smaller to fit. So, whatever I get as a mixer, I tend to try to use, but I tend to get too much these days from other producers. And then they say, oh, you just do what you want, thin it out if you like. And I'm thinking, couldn't you have made a decision before you handed it to me? So when I'm producing, I like to make those decisions in advance. As I'm producing the record, I'm panning things, putting things where I want them in the mix so that I know I don't need anything else there.
Mhm.
I may not need more melody. I may just need a shaker like in a second verse or a tambourine because percussion can add a lot to a song without adding more quote unquote notes to the music, more harmonic structure. It adds a groove, it takes up some space, but it doesn't add more harmonic structure to make it more complicated harmonically. I think that's why the Beatles were so great with their percussion. You hear on Beatles records, their tambourines, their shakers, their bongos are pretty prominent, in the mixes. The way the Rolling Stones will bring in a maraca in the second verse. They don't bring in another guitar part because you don't really need another guitar part, but you need something to keep the listener interested and the groove moving forward. So for me, percussion adds a lot to the kind of records I make because they tend to give you something like an ear candy without adding more harmonic structure.
What are the most common mistakes you see in mixes that they don't translate well?
Well, these days, people mixing with subs, so they may not actually have enough bottom end, or they have wobbly bottom end. I mean, if you have, the bottom end, also since we're not dealing with vinyl as much, or a vinyl curve, CDs or just general digital files are earth to light, so there tends to be a much wider frequency spectrum, which tends to sometimes mean that you have more high frequency and more low frequency energy that you would have in what someone might call a vinyl curve, because you could only fit so much on a piece of vinyl. And not that I'm just this huge advocate of vinyl, but I do like that curve better. I think that curve tends to translate, like you asked the question of what translates. What tends to translate is when you understand your like parameters of what a speaker can reproduce. And so if you are only ever listening to speakers that have this very wide frequency response, you're not going to understand where your mid range is or what really matters, where the energy of the song is. So for me, that tends to be the most common mistake these days, is people having actually their speakers are too good and they don't work hard enough. And things don't translate out of studios that way. Back in the day when we were all using NS10s, that was a hard speaker to get to translate unless you understood it. You had to have like your woofers literally jumping out of the speaker. You wouldn't really hear them, but you'd see your woofer jumping out of the speaker, and you could understand how much low end you had more by the extrusion of the speaker than what you heard. And then speakers came into play that were better sounding, like Genelecs, but made us work less. We didn't work as hard on a Genelec to make, and so my mixes didn't translate as well on a speaker like that. Had to learn. So I eventually found my way to a couple of different speakers. I track on Quested H108s that are passive, and I mix on these keys and these hothouses. And for me, it's the amount of information that's in the mix and the bandwidth. Like I generally, like when I'm mixing, I tend to bypass or get rid of everything underneath like 12 cycles, because you'll have stuff down there that is just wasted energy, and then like 70K or something above that, you want to have the air, but there's a point where you are getting into energy above that isn't translating, but it's still energy taking away, because that's what you're dealing with in a mix, is energy and emotion.
And how important it is for you to check your mix in mono? Is it something you do regularly?
Yeah, I like mono. I constantly am going back and forth to mono. Yeah, it's an important thing still, because there's mixes have to translate in supermarkets and in those places that are that's a big joke between myself and the artist Keb Mo, because one of the early records he did, the mixes were the guitars had some kind of phase thing on them that they sounded cool in stereo, but the guitars went away in mono, and he was in a supermarket, and like all he heard was really his voice and a kick and snare. It was like really and some not really bass, because those speakers don't translate bass. But he was like, "What the heck happened to my mix?" Yeah, so yeah, mono's important. I mean, for me, it is. Somebody doing Atmos would probably disagree. So,
do you like to use any kind of metering or analysis tools while mixing?
No.
Right. And do you ever use reference tracks while mixing?
Only for inspiration, not I don't put it up in the middle of a mix. That, for me is distracting.
Mm-hmm.
I know my speakers, and I might put something up to like remind me of an effect that what was that effect that I really liked? And I might go to, or, how did that original Freddie King sound, that all that weird lo-fi and the piano's really small? Do I want to do that? Other than that, going back and forth to try to, let me just say something. If you're insecure, don't sit down between the speakers. Go take a walk. Get confident, feel good about yourself and about choices, and then sit down and have a good time. Get to work.
Mm-hmm.
Insecure, and I'm not, I don't want someone out there listening to this and telling me to F off or why are you judging me? But I'm just going to say it again. Like, the insecure mixer is the one that doesn't trust his choices and is going to always be questioning everything. And I have a little saying that comparison is the thief of joy. Compare and despair.
I like
You'll
that.
put up like somebody else's mix and it'll sound so awesome and it's been mastered and then you'll put up your mix that you're working on and it won't be doing that and you'll want to quit and you'll just want compare and despair. Comparison is the thief of joy. So do I use songs and things to reference for inspiration? Absolutely. But if I'm going to put something up that's going to demoralize me because whatever I'm working on isn't going to sound as good because it wasn't, I'm not, you don't have Manu Katché playing the drum part in Red Rain, or your band is not U2 or the Rolling Stones. It's whatever it is. So it could be really freaking good, but now you're comparing, so who are you comparing yourself to? For me, I just got to do the best job I can possibly do today, and hopefully it stands up and stands the test of time. So, yeah, I'm not a big, again, those are my two sayings, that comparison is the thief of joy and compare and despair.
Have you tried Baby Audio's plugins? They're designed to inspire creativity and enhance your music production experience. From their Crystalline River plugin, offering ultra-clean reflex free of metallic artifacts, to Spaced Out, a hybrid reverb and delay workstation that combines over 50 individual effects. Baby Audio provides tools that can transform your sound. Right now you can get an exclusive discount on all their plugins. Just use the code Hogarth15 at checkout. Don't miss out. Click the link in the description and elevate your music today. Do you tend to mix at a consistent monitoring level, or do you vary the volume throughout the process?
I'll crank it up pretty loud when I'm getting kick, snare, bass relationship. Really want to feel the movement of air. My ears can't, I don't think one's ears can take that level all day. Your ears close down, my ears close down. My balances are way better at that normal sort of 85, 90-ish kind of dB. And I know my volume in my room. I know, I've been doing this long enough. I don't have like a dB meter and everything. I have VUs on my little playback here. I can see how hot my mix is. I know how hot my mixes are. I don't print hot. I like mastering engineers. They have a value to me. I don't master my own mixes. I believe that's like the doctor operating on himself. I would never go to a doctor who said, "Hey, look at this great operation I did on myself yesterday." I'd be like, "That guy's a whack job. I'm out of here." I took out my spleen yesterday.
Uh-huh.
What I mean? I just don't believe. I need an objective listener. My mastering engineers have always been the objective guy that puts on the little extra bit of smiley curve or whatever is needed. And, so if my mix is a pretty sexy looking actress, she still needs a makeup person. Generally, actresses don't put their own makeup on. Hair and makeup. That's, the person that does hair and makeup on a movie is a very valuable person. So that person to me is my mastering engineer. So yeah, I tend to do all my real mixing at a sort of like we could have a conversation if I was mixing generally. I wouldn't have to turn it down to talk. But when I am getting things like moving in the room, and then there's a point where when I've got a balance I really like, I'll turn it up and I'll crank it and I'll close my eyes. Because I was just having this conversation with a guitar player yesterday. The speakers never lie. Mm-hmm. We tell lies to ourselves. My head, my mind's a bad neighborhood. If I'm up there thinking too much, I can mug myself. I don't want to go there completely alone because I'll mug myself. So I believe the mind's a bad neighborhood. And I believe that like when you're in a studio and people are trying to justify whether something's good or bad or not, everyone stops talking, push play. What do the speakers say? The speakers don't lie. The speakers will tell you whether your balance is good or whether it's grooving or whether your vocals in or out of tune or whether your guitar is good. Speakers don't lie. We tend to think too much, not listen enough. So for me, I just work at kind of a pretty constant, volume all day, and then I'll crank it up and close my eyes and make sure that the emotion and the vibe is good. But I won't listen there all day balancing to that, because if I do, my balances tend not to be very, very good. The detail isn't in there. And I actually like detail. I'm a detail-oriented mixer, producer, engineer.
And from your perspective, what makes the difference between a good mix and a truly great one?
How it makes you feel. In the end, how does it make you feel? I mean, I've heard mixes where things are, to me, like, wow, how did he get away with like that bass so freaking loud, but I love it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or, man, those drums, man, they're kind of way back there, but man, it makes the vocal sound really cool. Whatever. I think in the end, it's all subjective. What do you like? I don't know. What do I like? When you sit down and watch someone put like a shitload of hot sauce on a meal and you go, how can that person ever eat that? And the person that's eating it has got this big wide grin on their face. And you just go, takes all kinds, Mm-hmm. I mean, I have specific hot sauces that I love, and I have others that I don't really care for. I really don't like Tabasco, but I love Red Rooster. Mm-hmm. There's I love specific Cajun. There are others that I don't really care for. So to me, it's all a matter of taste. I'm not someone that likes to add salt really to much of my food, but you need a little bit of it on most things you cook. So, I think it's really all a matter of taste. For me, I like a well-balanced mix. I like to hear the vocal most of the time, but I also marvel at the mixes where the vocal's tucked back and I'm like totally digging it, Because, I mean, you can change your whole mix with the vocal level. Between vocal and snare level, you can change your whole mix. You can have a country pop song if you turn the vocal way up. You can have like an Americana rock song if you turn it down and turn the snare up. You can have a country pop song if you turn the guitars down a little bit and the vocal's loud. You can have a rock song if you turn the guitars up and the snare up and turn the vocal down a little bit. You know what I'm saying? It's like same instrumentation, mm-hmm. Same exact instrumentation, same exact processing. Don't change anything. Just change the balance. You can change the whole feel of the song, and it'll fit into a different genre.
What things do you do when you feel a mix is too flat and lacks life?
Pull it down and start over. Just pull the faders down to 0. Pull it all down. Start over. Because, you can't build, if you're building a house, you don't frame it until the foundation's right. So like sometimes the foundation's off. Sometimes just that you've been working on a weird foundation. So sometimes it's better for me to just pull it down and start over. But that's a very nebulous question. You'd have to get more specific with me on that one.
Hmm.
But in general, if I have something that's not working, I just start over. I'll just go back. I'll turn everything off. I'll go back to, if we're talking rock, if we're just, or whatever, if we're talking just not rock, but, basic, drums, bass, guitars, piano, whatever, I'll just strip it all down again and just go back to my foundation and see what's going on. It might have started wrong. I might have, maybe I overcompressed the drums and there's too many cymbals and now my guitars are fighting through that because cymbals eat guitars. Some of the greatest like productions that people love, like Jeff Lynne or Tom Petty, they had the drummers not hit cymbals and then they super compressed the drums. So the cymbals didn't get all washed out, eating up everything. But when you listen to a lot of stuff like 90s, Foo Fighter, Nirvana, all those things, the drummers have to play that smashy stuff. So the cymbals, you have to be really careful now if you want really good smashy drums. You have all these cymbals eating everything up. So when you're balancing that shit, if you're compressing your drums too much and have the cymbals all washy, you'll make your guitars too bright because they got to cut through that stuff. So now you're already off. You're going down a road one direction that your vocals are going to have to get through the cymbals and the guitars now. So when it's just a thing. So a lot of times you might just have to pull it down, start over, and see what you're doing. And that would be the best way instead of trying to fight it.
Hmm.
I mean, again, anything you resist will persist.
What kinds of things do you do in production or mixing to help people connect more with a song?
Dynamics. The difference between a mix and a balance, like a mix and a flatline balance.
Hmm.
I mean, a mix is when things are moving. Things are coming up and down. You might be changing the delay or a verb from the verse to the chorus so that it opens up. Verse might be he or she's telling the story, so it's more intimate, it's more in your face. So you use less effect. And then when it hits the chorus, you maybe have some backgrounds, and that opens it up. You might have the guitars panned more narrow in the verses, or maybe it's one guitar and one, and then in the chorus it goes and it opens up and it gets bigger, or whatever the dynamic of the song is. Dynamics are a very important part for me of delivering an emotion, whatever that might be. And then there's things like, he just recently passed away, Sly Stone, Sly and the Family Stone. There's songs that, like Everyday People, which is a song that Edgar Winter and I are re-recording for his new record. That song, basically, the bass line inherently never changes the whole song. And the drums and the bass never really it doesn't get really big in the choruses. It's just kind of like, and then the chorus is like the high vocal, I am everyday people. You know what I mean? It's like the vocals get big and bright and the melody changes, but the dynamic of the song never really goes and jumps up from like 6 to 10 or whatever. So a lot of times the arrangement can be anything that creates a dynamic. Sly has these amazing arrangements in his writing. His writing is, a great place to do some homework on, because, if you listen to Stand or Everyday People or, In Time, some of these things where the dynamic never really goes and gets huge and small and huge and small, like a Foo Fighters or some other kind of music. But it's in the arrangement. It's in the high notes and the harmonies. It's in the melody, So anything that can deliver emotion and dynamics, I think that's the end goal, is that whatever you're trying to achieve, you do. And there's a lot of different ways and, vehicles per se to get that across. So as a mixer, I'll try to take the best of whatever tools I might have, and make things somewhat, I say non-linear, because you don't want to bore the listener into not wanting to listen. If they hear a verse, a verse, a chorus, and nothing changes, they might not want to listen again. They may just turn it off because they've heard everything they're going to hear. But if you give them something different, they're going to want to come back and hear it again because the mind kind of goes, what was that? That was cool.
Mm-hmm. And how do you create space for vocals during mixing? I mean, besides muting all the other instruments.
Really depends what, these are very general questions, I must say. I'm trying to answer them because it's all genre and voice specific. If you're a female with a soft voice, you're not going to use a high-pitched snare drum barking through the middle of the mix because it's going to be so distracting and beating up that voice. But if you're a low, husky, rich male vocalist, you're not going to use sometimes in a rock song like a fat, tubby snare because it's going to not give enough energy to this low, husky voice. You're going to probably need to come a little above the voice.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So, like, how you end up choosing the instrumentation is relative to the voice, and then what you put around it is whether you want the voice to kind of get beaten up a little bit by that or stay out of the way. Like most recent record I produced is this artist Morgan Miles. Her songs are being dropped as each month there'll be a new Morgan Miles, Myles, Morgan Miles. And she's like an Americana country artist. She's got a strong voice, but she's a female vocalist. So I didn't go with high-pitched snares on this record. There are tunings of each snare is for the pitch of the song and where she's singing. I have muscular guitars, but they're not as grindy as I might use on a similar song with a different singer. And there's a lot of acoustic and like things like pedal steel, but you got to watch the range of a pedal steel against a female vocalist because you could end up putting something really beautiful, but it's going to compete with the melody. Mm-hmm. So I'm very much melody. Like I don't want anything to get in the way of the melody unless I'm doing that intentionally. And my whole thing is that this is a picture frame. I'm really into art. My dad was an artist. I grew up around art my whole life. What are you framing? What's in the frame? What do you want the listener or the person to look? Are you drawing them in to look at what you want them to see? Mm-hmm. Or are you distracting them with too much and they don't know what to look at? Or is there enough distraction to keep them staring at it for quite a while, but still get what you want them to see? Audio is similar to that. I like things that sort of morph and change through the song. I'm not really a big guy that likes to cut and paste choruses. I want singers to sing the chorus so the first chorus is different than the second chorus, even though, musically I don't cut and paste. I'm very little in the kind of productions that I do. I mix stuff that people do that, and I find it kind of less emotional. Sometimes it's cool to have a background part sort of almost sound like a sample, but that's intentional. So those are the intentional things, not because I'm lazy and I don't want to record it. So I tend to make musicians play because I get a little nuance. I get something that's just a little different on each section. And then when I go to mix that, I can feel that and it makes me feel good. So in the end, when I'm working on a song, I like how it makes me feel. If I like how it makes me feel, it's the best I can do. Because in the end, I can't tell someone how to feel, but if I'm happy with it, that's the most control I'm going to ever have over it. Because when it's out of my hands, I'm powerless over it. I can't do anything about it. But when I'm dealing with it in the moment, I want to make sure that it's doing what I want it to do. So I tend to be pretty meticulous about all these things we're talking about. I take pretty much, just about everything we talk about, I don't shrug off. I might shrug the artist off a little bit if that person says, hey, can we play back this right in the middle of a mix? I'm like, no, I'd really rather not. That would be like, hey, can we eat a bowl of ice cream in the middle of like dinner? No, how about we wait for that?
Totally.
It'll taste better then.
Mm-hmm. Is your mix bus still fully analog?
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say that, basically I come out of an an insert on either an aux or if I on an aux, because auxes are, it depends if I'm putting a fade on something, because I generally will map a fade, but then give it to the mastering guy to put it on, because fades with master faders change the compression level as it comes down, because the master fader is, the insert is post master fader, So, but I'll come out into some transformers of some choice of, because I like what a transformer does to a digital signal. It smooths out immediately the waveform, because, not to be like talking down on anyone, but it's a step ladder. Digital is it's a step ladder of creating a sine wave. So I'll go into my choice of transformers. It comes out of a dangerous D to A, which I really like the sound of the dangerous because it's very transparent. There are other D to A's, A to D's that are more colored, but I'm already coloring everything. So I like my D to A and my A to D to be a transparent. Like for me, my metaphor tends to be like doing Photoshop with sunglasses. I don't want to color. If I'm like using Photoshop, I would not be wearing sunglasses. So I want to choose how much color I want to put it. So I choose a transformer after the dangerous. Then it goes into a dangerous backs. It knocks down 12 cycles and like 70K. And then it goes into a Dramastic Obsidian or a 2500 API. I used to also use the SSL, not the SSL, but the Smart. But I just like the Dramastic Obsidian because it's got the high pass filter on the low end. It's just doesn't pump, and it's punchy, and it's got that SSL sound. But it's the guy that makes it, John Ellis, who just redid the console for Bob Clear Mountain. That's his company is Dramastic. I love his compressor. I've been using it for about 20 years. So it'll come out of that into a NTI, old 90s NTI, which is Maag, M-A-A-G. The NTI company was Cliff Moggs before he just put his own name. And then from that, it'll go into a pair of mastering Pultecs for the tube and the transformer that are stepped. And then it goes back to the dangerous to get back into Pro Tools. So yeah, that's all analog. And the only digital part of that is I will use a plugin that's I'm using it super, super subtle, and I really like the sound of it, and I'm not using it for really the clipping part of it, but sometimes I will use it for just that little taste of, because clipping is not limiting, and it's called Kazrog K-Clip 3. Kazrog is a company that I support. It's my friend Shane McPhee. His dad is John McPhee, a very close dear friend of mine who plays in the Doobie Brothers. And Shane's company, Kazrog, I was there at the beginning with him. He's a great guy, and he makes some really cool plugins. He just released the Stay Level compressor, which is sort of the old Gates Stay Level and the new Retro, which I have two of those in my rack. I use a lot of retro gear, retro instruments. And so that Kazrog K-Clip it has a sound. It has a very, I can't explain it, but it tends to just generally give a nice little tightening in a very gentle way. And if you looked at it, you would see it's not really doing anything, but sonically doing something. I did try and I have it, I think it's called Gold Clip. That's way more sonically imprinting to me. And I like it on individual tracks at times, along with a lot of other plugins, but not on my mix bus. I've tried it a few different times on the mix bus. I didn't dig it. It's like When I put something on and it makes it sound different, but not in a good way, I turn it off. And you have to get used to, like, just because it gets louder doesn't mean it's better. There are a lot of plugins where you put it in and it doesn't. It's not like a Unity thing, and you just hear it get louder, and you think it's better. But when you put it in Unity, then you can really hear what it's doing, and it's not getting better. So you have to get really understanding of the GUI of a plugin, because you can get fooled into the GUI. Like, that GUI looks so cool, sounds good. No, what you see is not what you hear.
Have you ever tried mixing with only plugins on your mix bus?
Oh man, I have to sometimes, like I'll be somewhere and, someone will want something mixed, and it's hard for me. It's hard. It'd be like asking a guitar player, man, here, will you just play this, like, I just bought this new Strat. Can you just leave your 63 Strat at home and just play my new Strat? The guy would probably be like, "Oh man, really? You're gonna make me do that?" But we do what we got to do. Form fits function.
So, talking about guitars, what are your go-to microphones and preamps for capturing electric guitars?
I'm very old school when it comes to the preamps in general, because I grew up on consoles. We didn't bring all these Gucci custom preamps in the studio when we made records. You were on a Trident console, you were on an Eve console, you were on an API console. You might even be on like a sound workshop or a Neotech or whatever the heck you were on. And that's what you put your mics through. You know what I mean? But the mic is the deal for me. I'm a big proponent of Royer. I've been using the Royer mic since the get-go. I'm sort of the poster child for Royer guitar. Like I've always, but going back into guitars in the 80s, like Motley Crue, when I was doing Girls, Girls, Girls with Dwayne Barron, who was the lead engineer on that, and I worked with him. We set up in this back warehouse room at Rumbo. I had all these RCAs. And I said and Dwayne was like, "Really? You want to try it?" I'm like, "Man, check them out." And he kind of had his mind blown, but we also blew ribbons all the time. And I was sending ribbons to New York for this guy, Clarence Kane. He had a company called ENAC, which was Kane backwards. And he was the re-ribbon guy. And he was the RCA guy. And I think maybe his son, maybe that company's still around. I haven't re-ribboned an RCA in a long time. But we were re-ribboning a lot of RCAs because, we were using 77s and 44s. And the only mic that you could get up relatively close that I know Eddie Kramer used, I think, back on Jimi Hendrix, was a Beyer 160. But that's a different sound. That's almost more like a condenser mic. But there's something about the figure 8 that I love. But I do love it in conjunction with a dynamic mic and really just either a good Neodyne 57 or just a 57. So I'm a big 57 Royer guy. And then I'll use a 67 a few feet back, and then maybe a farther back room mic on solos and stuff. But on rhythm parts, I don't really need unless it's a very specific rhythm part that wants a lot of room or something on it. Generally, the figure 8 configuration of a Royer, either 122 or 121 or 122V, and they've got a new one coming out that's called an R12. That's a great mic. It'll be out like in a month or two. I don't know when this podcast gets released, but we just did a bunch of tests on that mic, and that mic's killer. So I'm a huge Royer guy, and I know people like the AEAs. Those work great, and there's some other ribbons, and then there are other ribbons that are sort of fakers that aren't really as good. And since Royer was the company that came out with a ribbon mic that you would not blow up close in phase with a 57, everyone's been trying to chase that because that's the deal. If you don't have yourself in phase, you can't really use both mics in a nice sort of almost equal amount. And I use them like EQ. The 57 I place in a place that sounds good, and it's the brighter mic, and then I bring in the Royer, and it brings in the bottom. And I generally don't EQ my microphones to tape, or to I say to tape, but I generally don't EQ them unless that bus of the two still really needs something that the two mics in conjunction still aren't giving. And so that's usually like an API or some other EQ like that, like a Chandler, EMI, and then maybe a LA3 or a 1176, depending on what I want out of the guitar. If I want to take off the spank of a spank and have it more compressed, or that's all to taste. But the conjunction of a 57 and a Royer is a guitar sound for me that is, I can get a guitar sound in like 2 minutes if I know where the mics are placed perfectly and I have a flashlight.
Done.
Yeah.
A lot of guitar players don't like to double tracking their parts. How do you usually fill the stereo space without having the guitar sitting in the center competing with the vocals and the bass?
Now you move it over to the side and have maybe kind of cop the bit of the Van Halen thing in its own way, where you have like something moving to the other side, like a delay or a delayed reverb, or that room. You pull the room mic and put it in a place that on its own can be panned over, and you hear the space of the guitar.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Now I have a couple of questions from the audience, and the first one is you were talking about Van Halen. I absolutely love the guitar tones you achieved when working with Van Halen. Could you share a bit about how those sounds were created?
You just asked about that. Like with Eddie, most all Van Halen records are not double tracked, because he would play the part with all these nuances and squeals and all the, and for him to have to double that, not even just him, but guitar players, when they know they're going to double the guitar, simplify their part, because they don't have to worry about learning every little personality nuance to have to double that, because that's incredibly time consuming. And why, if you're doubling it, do you want to sort of make it sound that way, where you can't, because human beings, it's almost impossible to be perfect. So if this guitar is like perfect on its own, but you try to double it, you can hear all the imperfections then, where on its own, it's perfect, if that makes sense. So the thing I did with Ed that was, I know that you don't come into a Van Halen record and tell Eddie, well, here, this is how we're going to do it. So you come in, to Ed's world, and you see what he's doing, and he wasn't using ribbons. He was using one cabinet. He'd have two 57s, and he'd split them, and he would delay them a little differently. So they were doing this more electronic bounce, but it was not a dedicated analog bounce of stereo left and right. So I came in and we talked about it, and I said, you've got this splitter here that you use for live. Do you want to try messing around with something that I do sometimes? And at the time, he was also designing a new head. He had a 50 watt, he had the 100 watt, he had the Mark II. He's like, yeah, man, whatever. And so we started by just using two heads and two cabinets with the 57s, not an extra mic yet. And he already started to like that, because that's like a natural stereo, because speakers don't move absolutely perfectly. You know what I mean? So the left and right speakers are just doing this little dance, which creates this little stereo air dance. It still sums to mono. It still comes out of the center, in its own way, because it's one source, but it's one source into a splitter that's going into two heads. And I said, well, now you can, or, you have all these different choices, because he had his like guitar and, amp locker down we're up at 5150, so it's on his own property. He has all his gear is in in a vault, like a air conditioned vault. And I said, why, just for me, can we pull out the old Marshall and can we pull out some of your old gear and start messing around? And so we started to do that, and we started to have a really good time with like blending 2 amps. And I said, I got one thing I want to do now. I said, because right now you've got this API on both 57s where you're lopping on like a shit gob of 50 cycles to add low end, because 57s don't have any bottom, and he's looking for bottom. I said, I got this microphone that we're working on with this company, Royer. It's a tube ribbon mic. At the time, it was called. It became the 122V, and the 122V is basically like a 121 or a 122, except it's tube. And so it's got a lot of detail, a lot of bottom, a lot of full range. It's really a killer microphone. So I said, I'm going to put these up. I want you to check them out and just play. We'll record them on separate tracks. So you'll have your 57s. Now you'll have your Royers. I can put them right in phase, perfectly in phase, where the ribbon and the capsule, they'll be as in phase as I can get them. And you can just play with them, and we'll take all the EQ off the 57s. And when you want more low end, Ed, God rest his soul, was a great engineer. He just amazingly intuitive and an incredible engineer on his own. So he just sat there and would listen back, and he'd just turn the Royers up and down. And I would watch him as he turned the Royers up. He would start to really get off, because the Royers are bringing in natural low end, not EQ'd low end, to a microphone that doesn't have it. So it's a natural low end. It's not like a 50 cycle filter hump on an API. It's a mic that's capturing the low end that's at the speaker, and also bringing in a whole nother frequency response that is the mid range too, killer low mids that start to make the guitar really speak. Mm-hmm. And he totally understood it within like 5 minutes of sitting there. He was like, yeah, man, fuck yeah. So we got rid of the EQ off the 57s, and it just became a balance between the Royer and the 57, which is what I was doing and still do. You know what I mean? It wasn't anything, but to watch Ed see that, and then we would pick, and we would do this thing where, like, to pick the blend of the left and right amps was also really fun, because we would get like a left side amp that he was really happy with, but it may not be blending with the right side amp. And so we would change that until that sound was something. And we would do this on our own time, because you're not trying to turn it, but it's his own studio. And we got this, and it's like, and some days we would just record a DI and feed it back and play around with it that way. So we could just keep changing shit until he was like, that's fucking awesome. And, so there were things that we did that made those guitar sounds special, because he wanted something, he wanted to make space for Wolf's bass too. Like with Wolf's bass, we had it's a much grindier bass sound than on prior records, because Wolf comes from more like 90s and 2000s alternative music bass sound, So one of the things I did do was just move the guitars a little wider by just using time adjuster. Because if you take the time adjuster off, they're mostly in the center. So you could put a little time adjustment of basically like a delay, but within samples, and just move them out just a little bit. They're not out of phase or anything, because they're perfectly in phase. They just move a little wider to create more center space.
Here's another question. What is the best way to glue a mix?
I just think gluing a mix is, I don't over compress my mix bus. Mm-hmm. I generally just, my compressor on the mix bus, you can barely see the meter move. Usually for me, if I see the meter moving 2 to 3 dB, it's overly compressed already. But the glue of of the mix is the balance of the instruments and the individual. Some stuff needs to be compressed, some stuff doesn't. I don't compress guitars generally when I'm recording them because I want those dynamics and then I can control them if I want more so. But I like dynamics, but I don't like things that uncomfortably jump out. You know what I mean? Unless you want that. So glue on a mix tends to be a balance that'll play top to bottom in general, understanding that, like, okay, on this section, I got to turn the guitars down. So I might just generally trim them back like a couple dB while I'm just balancing so I don't have to imagine that. So it actually does the things I want, but I'm not yet like really automating. I'm just sort of trimming things so that when it plays down, it plays the song in the dynamic of the song. And then I'll go in and I'll write things, like sometimes aggressively, sometimes less aggressively. So the balance of a song to me is how it's gluing together, and that's the panning, the EQ, and the compression of everything all together. You have to carve out frequencies to make things fit. Panning places things in your stereo field. Old school was just left, center, right. So a lot of things on my mix are going to be left, center, right, because on old Neves, you didn't have pan pots. It was just LCR. You had a left button, a right button, and both buttons. So a lot of my mixes tend to be LCR, and then I'll pick the things I want, like in between, and that's the thing that doesn't want to live LCR because I want to use the whole scape. But if I'm panning something 90, put it 100. You know, if I'm panning something 10, maybe try it in the middle, but backgrounds tend to sound better moved out a little bit from the center. So I start playing around with the panning, and the panning tends to tell me everything. Panning is a lot. So,
Cool.
so to me, the glue is when I'm putting it together and seeing how it all sits together. And then I mix it. Then you start moving faders or, moving things. So there's a dance.
What's the easiest way to achieve the low end you need in the mix?
Low end tends to want some compression in general. If your bottom is moving too much uncomfortably, because, I'm not talking about a Moog or some kind of electronic bass, but bass guitars tend to be relatively uneven. When you go up on a bass, it's the reason, like on Paul McCartney on Beatles, and then where's that note? You know what I mean? So I definitely focus on, like, when I'm putting my kick and my bottom together, sometimes we have tools now like clip gain, how hard something's going to hit a compressor. You can actually clip gain something before it hits the compressor so it's a little more evened out. Or you really want those notes to jump out, like when the bass player goes up, but in general, you got to focus on where the foot and the bass live. And they generally can't live in the same place. Like if you put a ton of bottom on your kick drum and you try to put a ton of bottom on your bass, you're just going to have a really tubby mix. So if you want like your bass to fill out like the bottom, then you're going to want to put the kick drum like above it a little bit so that it has more like in the chest, less in like the nuts, if that makes sense. So decide, or it will already have been decided for you by how it's played. And, learn that you can't have the kick and the bass generally always in the same frequency space. So people that tend to solo instruments completely miss the boat. Solo button when you're mixing tends to be only for like if there's a problem, something distorting, is something not playing back right, the solo button, you should just forget it exists most of the time, because the solo button is not your friend when it comes to mixing. It's not your friend in general. It's your friend when you have a problem. And you're trying to figure out where the spitting is, or where the distortion is, or is that mic working, or do I have a problem here? But when it comes to mixing, no one has a solo button on their stereo at home to solo up your kick drum or whatever instrument. How does it blend? I mean, sometimes the weirdest little sounds awesome in the mix, and you solo it up and it sounds really weird. And you go, I got to change that. But then you put it back in the mix and you go, why did I change it? It sounded really cool. So one of the things that tends to be misunderstood about bass is that some amount of distortion or fuzz or something tends to help the bass speak in general on almost all styles of music, and more so on others. But bass is, for me, not like always just perfectly clean, because then it becomes sort of anemic. I don't like smacky bass unless you're going to backa, or you're doing heavy metal music where the kick drum's real ticky and the bass is real smacky. But because you got the kicks going and the bass is like, but in general, I like a bass that doesn't have all this top on it to get in the way of things. But you need some kind of distortion in there, some kind of something. Fuzz goes a long way. Fur goes a long way on bass to keep it from, and it also tends to, distortion and fur tends to like even out a bass. So you can have like the actual clean DI or amp, with its sort of nuances, and that bass fuzz sort of smooths in there. And in some ways, it has its own natural compression. I mean, that's what distortion. That's why I don't generally compress, power guitars. They're already compressed.
Mm-hmm.
The tube and the distortion is already compressing them. Do you really want them any more compressed?
Mm-hmm. Cool. Ross, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for sharing your time and wisdom today with us.
Yeah, I hope you got what you wanted.
It's more than what I wanted. Way more.
Yeah, I mean, often, this was a very, you were going very technically oriented,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'm more about the mindset that the mindset of what we're doing tends to come first for me.
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Before all the doing of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very mindset oriented in the way I make records. I believe that, that we have to have a vision of where we're going before we go there. It's like getting on the freeway without a roadmap. Some days it's okay if you're not going very far, but if you jump on the freeway and you don't know which direction you're going and you drive for a day, you could be a day away from where you wanted to be if you had a direction and you really only needed to go 20 minutes. One other direction. You know what I mean? So for me, having a vision of what I'm doing, or having some understanding and a good communication, if I'm, producing an artist or engineering for a producer, that tends to be really important, because then the doing part of it, I tend to hit the result better. So I'll just finish by saying, all the conversation we had about all this doing is all subjective to what are we doing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because, some days the rules, because you throw them out the window and nothing applies. You can have great success a day before with something, and then if I try to do the same thing every day, I'll find that didn't work, and I'll get stuck in trying to do something that I had success with. But I got to take each situation on its own. And so, being aware of that tends to help me, having made that mistake in the past, But yeah, man, thanks for having me. I hope this was, of some service to your peeps, and I'm glad we could finally do it. I know it took a while.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. So thank you once again.